everyone, and welcome to NASCAR Video Magazine, the Collector Series. I'm your host, Benny Parker. In this and every edition, we took you behind the scenes and to the front row of action in a way not available anywhere else. And here's what's in store as we bring the NASCAR lifestyle roaring right into your living room. I get to spend some personal time with one of NASCAR's most competitive and mysterious drivers, Alan Kulwicki. We'll visit with NASCAR legend Tim Flock. He shares some tall tales about the sport's earliest days, including the time he turned a flock of seagulls into a snowstorm en route to one of his Daytona victories. So wait till you hear this one. And there's more. Expert advice on collecting NASCAR memorabilia for fun and profit. A profile on Les Richter, the man we call Coach. And a tech report on how teams get their cars ready for qualifying. Hey, and let's talk about what we're going to do. Let's do it. And let's start with our cover story, part one of the evolution of a race car. To look at the evolution of the race car, we've come to the Joe Weatherly Museum at the Darlington International Raceway. This is the car that won the first Southern 500. It's a stock 1950 Plymouth, and I mean stock. It has the headlights, parking lights, tail lights. Look inside this thing. There's nothing different about this than any other car built in 1950. You see these headlights? Before the race starts, they've got to put tape over the headlights, tail lights, and parking lights, so that if they're involved in a crash or something hits one of the headlights, the glass when it comes out won't shatter and puncture a tire. And the tires were nothing but stock tires that you went to, well, Sears and Roebuck or someplace and bought. And why did they tape the glass up? Because when the race is over, they peeled the tape off and drove this car home. That's right, this car was driven from Burlington, North Carolina to Darlington, won the race, and they drove it back home. In the late 40s and early 50s, the Oldsmobile Rocket was the car of choice. This car was driven by Buck Baker here at Darlington, had a V8 engine, and was very fast. But probably the most dominant car in the early 50s was the fabulous Hudson Hornet. This is a 1951. And check it out, bench seat, no roll cage. This is a car that Herb Thomas drove in competition. Cars were also driven by Tim Flock, Marshall Teague. Fireball Roberts worked on these cars back in the early 50s. And the reason that the drivers liked this car so well, it was at a very low center of gravity, so in the corners, it really hung to the corners well. And then in 56, they started putting a few safety features in. Roll bars on the convertible driven by Curtis Turner. And check it out. Got a bungee cord holding down the hood of the car. I drove a 56 Ford. That's exactly how I held my hood down. But look inside. The cars are basically still stock. Stock hood hinges, shock absorber, stock, and in the stock location. This car was built by Holman and Moody back in 1956. And when we say built, basically all they did was build the engine and put the roll bar in so it would protect Curtis Turner's head in case he rolled over. But in 1959, the Daytona International Speedway opened. All of a sudden, we're talking about 140 miles an hour. So the cars had to be a little safer and a little stronger. Look at the roll cage in this 1959 Chevrolet. Looped by the windshield, back by the driver's head, and door bars, and bars that incorporated the loop bars, and hood pins to hold the hood down on the 59 Chevy, because all of a sudden, we're running 135, 40 miles an hour. Speeds unheard of in 1959. By 1963, the cars were up to 150 miles an hour. And hood pins, 3 hood pins to hold the hood down. And take a look inside. The cars are starting to look more and more like race cars. Air cleaner that feeds cool air to the engine. The engine is turning enough RPMs now that we have an oil cooler to cool the engine. This is a 427 Chevrolet engine they used back in 1963. And look, 2 racing shock absorbers on each wheel. Racing shocks, before just a stock shock in a stock location, now they're putting racing shocks on the wheels and 2 per wheel. Also, we put a wedge bolt down on top of the spring so that the mechanics are able to adjust the wedge as during the race or in practice just simply by turning that bolt. Then in 1966, Ford, all of a sudden their cars were rendered uncompetitive. The reason they had a big car, they needed a smaller car, but the problem, their car was a unitized body. I'll show you how they fixed that. First of all, let me explain a little bit about the unitized body. Over the years, the manufacturers had made the car in two parts. The frame, which all the suspension pieces bolted to that, and then the body just sit down on top of the frame. But in the mid-60s, they started making smaller cars. And they started making a unitized body, the frame and body all in one, and the suspension pieces just simply bolted to the body. Well, racing mechanics couldn't make that work because there was too much flex in the car, in the body. So what NASCAR decided to let the teams do was to make a race car. Now, we're getting away from stock cars, we're going to race cars. But again, it's the only way we could make the Ford car competitive. So Ford took the 66 Fairlane. This car was driven by Fred Lorenzen, and they put a 1965 Ford Galaxy frame under it. They had to narrow and shorten the frame to accommodate this body, but all of a sudden the Fords, once again, were competitive. This is where we ventured off into race cars and not stock cars. It looks like a Fairlane, but in fact, it is a race car. This car was built by Holman and Moody, and all of a sudden, they became car constructors and building cars for all the teams because you couldn't go to the dealership and buy these anymore. You had to go to a constructor. In the early 70s, Banjo Matthews started constructing cars, and then Hutcherson and Pagan. And now in the 80s and 90s, Mike Laughlin down in Greenville, Tennessee, Greenville, South Carolina, built a lot of race cars. But this was the first one, the 1966 Ford Fairlane. Let's take a look at some of these other cars. This is the 1967 Plymouth that Richard Petty drove. Remember back in early 1992 when Bill Elliott won 4 in a row? That was big news. In 1967, Richard won 10 in a row in this car and won 27 races in one season. They raced about 53 or 54 times, but he won 27 of them. And in the late 60s, the manufacturers, Ford, Chrysler, in trying to find an advantage, started making exotic cars. Check this out. This is a 1969 Dodge Daytona. This is an aerodynamic masterpiece. Check the nose. The rear wing in the back to stabilize the rear of the car. This was probably the best race car ever built back in the late 60s, early 70s. Ford retaliated with the Ford Talladega. Very good race car. But finally, NASCAR said, hey, enough is enough. No more special cars. We're running stock cars. The frames may be homemade, but the stock cars are cars like you go to the dealership and buy out of the showroom, the sheet metal at least. And then in 1971, something else happened that changed the evolution of the race car. Chevrolet wanted to come back into racing. They had a Monte Carlo, but the frame, and it did have a frame under it, they didn't have the pieces for it that were strong enough to run Daytona and Charlotte, Atlanta, the big track we were running now. And look, we're at 190 miles an hour some of these racetracks. So they let the Chevrolet people, Junior Johnson, who came back with that first Chevrolet, put a frame, a Ford frame under that Chevrolet, the same frame as under a Ford. But it used a Chevrolet engine and Chevrolet sheet metal. Once again, we don't have stock cars anymore. We're back to race cars, but they look like stock cars. And then, remember 1977 when your engine, you bought an Oldsmobile, it had a Chevrolet engine in it, and people went up in arms? Well, what happened then, what changed racing then was all of a sudden the Chevrolet 350 was a corporate engine, and you could use it in any General Motors sheet metal. So what the teams did, they found the best sheet metal, aerodynamic, and that's the car they ran at Daytona and Talladega. The Monte Carlo was the car of choice at the shorter tracks, but Daytona, Talladega, Charlotte, they all used the 442 Oldsmobile, just like this one that Cale Yarborough drove back in the late 70s. The reason, because aerodynamics. This had a 350 Chevrolet engine, but it was an Oldsmobile car. And all of a sudden you could use Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet sheet metal, whichever you chose, and you could all use the 350. That's kind of the evolution of race cars and how it's come about. Today, the cars are more race cars than ever. They're hand-built in almost every piece anymore. Remember the hood hinges back on those cars? The hoods today are held up by just little strips of aluminum. But the cars are still got to go by that template. They look like stock cars, and they measure to a stock car. Underneath, they're in fact a race car. Now, those were some beautiful old machines. These days, old NASCAR stuff is turning into a gold mine. In this special report, contributing editor Bob Ladford talked to Beatty McClure, editor of Collector's World magazine, to find out how you can get involved with collecting, definitely for fun, and maybe for profit.
One of the newest phenomenons, and something that's allowed people to get involved in racing vicariously, has been the collectibles. We're here at the offices of Collectors World with editor and publisher B.D. McClure to talk about how do people get involved as collectors, and where do you start?
Bob, probably the best place to start is in your carport, your attic, your utility room, your dresser drawers. You may, if you went to the races, you may have brought home an old program in the 70s or the 80s. You may have saved your ticket stub. If it should happen to have a driver's picture on it, it's valuable. Even if you were in the infield, lots of times they threw sheet metal over the fence when they had wrecks, and I know people that brought it home, and it's quite valuable now.
If you'd never gone to the races, how would you get started as a collector?
There's a lot of publications on that have cataloged the stuff now, and it's you can keep up with it quite well, but you need to do your homework. There's a lot of good dealers. The flea markets, there's a lot of racing stuff in flea markets. You just kind of have to know what you're buying, so you need to do your homework.
Going back to the origin, when did all of this really get started? Where did it come from?
Well, what really started the ball rolling was when Jim McCulloch made the Max cards in '88. That really got it started, but there were cards before that. But some of the cards that were like, this is a 1972, what we call a STP card. It was given away in '72. It's about a $200 card now. A business card. That's a Ned Jarrett business card that was worth nothing, you know, and it's a couple $100 now because how many survived? This card was given away. This is a winner's circle card. It was given away in '89. This particular card is about $800.
How does a beginner or a collector weed through all of this material?
Easiest way is there's lots of good dealers. If you like die-cast cars, if you like little trucks, if you like cards, pick out the things that you like. Don't try to collect everything. You can't collect everything. There's lots of stuff out there. Don't try to collect it for a profit. If you just collect what you like and you build a good collection, you're going to be happy if you ever decide to sell it.
What is a reaction among collectors, say, when a driver changes teams or a sponsor changes? What does this do to the items?
That means it's going to be a limited run. If he changes in the middle of the year, that's a winner. You know, a lot of drivers change at the end of each year. A lot of sponsors change. That just creates another collector.
Let's see some of the items in your personal collection.
This is a die-cast collection, Bob. We've been collecting die-casts for a long time, so we have most all of them. But we were talking about collecting a few minutes ago. You don't, whether it's cards, posters, postcards, you collect what you like. This collection has different categories in it. This is the Earl, the Winross, the Matchbox. You don't have to collect all of them. You can pick out which one you like. These are the Convoys, and these are the legend cars. The guys are as old as you are. The 59 Chevrolets,
those
the 56
cars were new cars. I remember them.
You also have some old Earls, racing champions. You can pick what you like. Posters. These are my favorite collectible. This is a mid-50s posters of the Shelby Fairgrounds. It was a dirt race, but what's interesting is who promoted the race, Bruton Smith. These things were tacked on telephone poles on the side of restaurants, barns, and not many of them survived. So this is another one of those pots at the end of the rainbow if you can find one.
Oh yes, some of the old sandwich board signs. I hung many of those.
Yeah. Another interesting collectible is comic books. This is one of the first ones. It's a 1980, really 79 to 80 Richard Petty. If you bought one then, it was $250. You'd be lucky to find one for $50 now.
Oh yes. And the old postcards.
You bet. Another favorite of mine is postcards. These things, a big run of these things in the 60s and 70s was 1,000. They're true collectibles. There were people collecting them then, but not near like they are now. They can't be reproduced. It's easy to find a good postcard, and if you're lucky, you can get a valuable one. If you get one with an old driver's autograph on it, it's quite valuable. This is Fireball Roberts. Believe it or not, there's other forms of racing besides NASCAR. These are old dinky toys. They were made in the early 50s, but they're of Indianapolis cars. This little car here is interesting. It's 1964, but the Ford dealers sold them for $1. But it was Jimmy Clark at Indianapolis. But what's interesting to me is the Woods brothers pitted this car, and they made the fastest pit stop of the race. Statues are pretty interesting. This statue just come out a short time ago. It's about $85. This one was in the early 70s of Richard Petty. It's a couple $100 if you could find one.
That's so much interesting stuff, Davey. Thank you so much
Yes,
for sharing. What are those rags over there?
That's another good collectible. This is Benny Parsons' 1973 crew chief uniform. They probably weren't, but selling them. There's a lot of people who collect uniforms now, and some of them are really valuable. A one of a 7 it's got to be valuable.
Oh, yes. Well, it certainly sounded like fun, and I think it's something a lot of people can get into as collecting.
You bet. They just need to collect what you like and have a good time with it.
What a collection. Man, I could practically have retired on what I've given away during my career. But we just had no idea this stuff was going to be worth anything. Now there's a man who's driving hard to make some history. He's one of the most interesting and complex men ever to get behind the wheel of a Winston Cup car. Wisconsin native and owner of the Hooters Ford, Alan Kawicki. Coming from the American Speed Association, 1985 marked the first year that Alan Kawicki drove Winston Cup. In 5 starts, his best finish was 13th. The next season, he competed in 23 events and won Rookie of the Year honors. Since then, he's progressed steadily through the standings, making his mark with consistently strong qualifying efforts. He's overcome adversity throughout his life and career. Let's meet him. Just how did you get started in the racing business?
Well, I was always brought up around racing. My dad built race car engines, and I was just always around race cars. And I started racing go-karts when I was like 13 or 14, and started racing stock cars when I was 18, and did it as a hobby all through college. And after getting my degree in mechanical engineering, working 2 years as an engineer, having done all that, I still felt that what I really wanted to do was race, and so I left the engineering field and went racing professionally, and been doing it ever since.
What college did you go to?
University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Graduated from there and went to work for a company called Applied Power, working on the bare wheel alignment equipment. And first thing I did when I went to work for them was adapt their equipment into a system that they used on the Indy cars at the Bear Garage and Gasoline Alley. And I did that. It was pretty neat for 6 months, and then I got on the regular production stuff, and the next 6 months were okay, and then, you know, another 6 months I knew that racing was really what I wanted to do professionally, that I just got a greater sense of accomplishment or more satisfaction out of that than I did. I was just not a behind-the-desk type person, I guess.
When you first started, were you successful in racing?
I was never a dominant driver at any level, really, I think. I think that once I became good at a certain level, if I could win, I'd try to move on to the next level instead of staying there for 3 or 4 or 5 years and trying to be dominant or win the most races. If I was proficient, if I could win there, then I set my sights on the next level.
When in your racing career did you figure out that NASCAR Winston Cup is where you wanted to be?
Probably at one time USAC and NASCAR were sort of on a par back in, actually when my dad was involved in it, late 60s or early 70s. And, you know, through good promotion and management, NASCAR grew into what it is today, and USAC just sort of faded out, especially the stock car division. And so, you know, probably by the late 70s, you could sort of see that NASCAR racing was a place to be, and that had been my goal for at least 5 to 7 years before I ever got down south. And I knew I always wanted to, you know, like a lot of people thought I always could, but the biggest question was, would I ever get the chance to?
Allen's chance came at the Daytona 500 in 1985. His Quincy's Thunderbird was on the track, but was passed by 2 cars in the final lap. He didn't make the show. After your rookie season, Quincy's quits as a sponsor. Did you ever think you'd see any light at the end of the tunnel?
I mean, I look back at that and I say, I don't know how I ever did that. If I had to do it over again, I don't know if I could. And I couldn't operate another year that way. I had to have a bigger budget to operate on to progress at all. And they were fighting some takeover bids and so forth, and had to actually cut back on their advertising. So they got out, and that's when Xerox Antifreeze came along.
Then after 4 years, Xerox went away.
Things changed in the antifreeze business. Market conditions changed, and you know, the price of antifreeze went way up and then way back down, and basically they got out of racing. Actually had to start the following year with no sponsor. And by, you know, the times I've made the biggest gains are the times I've taken the biggest risks in my career, and I had to take another big risk to keep the team going without a sponsor and keep the people here and keep them on the payroll without a sponsor. That was pretty tough to do.
Hooters has come along as a sponsor. Does that make all the trials and tribulations over the past 10 years worthwhile?
Having them as a sponsor and for the next 3 years has put our team in really good shape, and I think that, you know, having to sort of weather that storm of not having a sponsor going through that tough time, this has really made it worth it. It's the first time in my career I've ever had a multi-year sponsorship, and now I think we're a lot more solid and a lot more stable than a lot of teams are. You know, we don't have to worry about are we going to be able to buy good parts for the car, or are we going to have a sponsor next year? Are we going to be here next week or next month or next year?
With everything that you've been through, it's obvious that you have a mental toughness that not everyone has. Where did it come from?
Well, it's hard for me to say for sure, but there's things that happened early on in my life that probably contributed to that. And, you know, I think that my mom died when I was in 2nd grade, and my brother and I and my dad lived with my grandmother, and she helped raise us. And my grandmother died when I was in 7th grade. My brother died when I was in 8th grade. So I probably had to deal with a lot of adversity early on in life. And somehow or another, you find a way to keep going. And, you know, my dad was busy building race car engines and off-racing a lot like I am right now. So I had to learn how to do a lot of things for myself. And when it came time to go racing, he never did it for me. I'd always ask him a lot of questions, but, you know, he never got me a break or got me a sponsor or bought a car for me or ever spent any money on the cars, really. So just, you know, sometimes people get things just handed to them and they never have to work hard enough for it to appreciate it. Well, I think I have had to work hard for it, and having to deal with, I don't know, but I think having to deal with a lot of those tough things like that early on in my life probably had something to do with it.
Alan, there's a plaque over on your wall that says, "The pursuit of perfection is frustrating and a waste of time because nothing is ever perfect. The pursuit of excellence is commendable and worthwhile. Therefore, strive for excellence, not perfection." Did you say that?
I've read a lot of, like, self-improvement type books, positive attitude type books, that sort of thing. And, you know, maybe I've been a perfectionist in the past, or, you know, there's some of those tendencies to have to work that hard to get to this point. You've got to be a little bit of a workaholic or a little bit of a perfectionist to try to make it. And then eventually you realize, well, maybe that's not the best way to do it. And somewhere along the line, I probably did. I would get frustrated trying to make everything perfect, you know. And I think as time goes on, I'm better at accepting the things that aren't perfect, you know, but they're good enough to get the job done. And so that's sort of the way I look at things right now. If you try to make everything perfect, you'll just wear yourself out. You'll get frustrated. You'll get mad, on, because nothing is ever perfect. But you can make things close to perfect. You can make them excellent. And so strive for excellence, not perfection.
It's great to get a chance to see these drivers away from the racetrack and look at the personal side without all the pressure that's on them at the racetrack. And no doubt, Alan Kulwicki is a driver with a bright future to go along with his current success. Now, a man whose place in NASCAR history is well established is living legend Tim Flock. He was a two-time Grand National champion, which was what the circuit was called the days before Winston Cup. This true gentleman spent some time with us. He talked about his life, his career, and gave us a peek at his incredible personal collection of memorabilia. The NASCAR in the 50s, the man to watch out for was Tim Flock. He collected 40 victories and 37 poles, as well as 2 championships, one in 52 and the other in 55. We sat down with him in his own museum of memorabilia that his wife collected for him and heard some classic stories from the past. So when did you start driving a race car?
Benny, my first race was at North Wilkesboro back in 1948 in the modified cars. This was before Grand National racing started.
What do you mean a modified car? Now, you got to remember, I was born in 1941, so I don't know much about those cars.
Well, I got to take you back for the young audience watching us today, but back in Atlanta, back in the early 40s, there was about 15 or 20 bootleggers that hauled moonshine liquor out of Dahlonega, Georgia, the Georgia mountains back into Atlanta. And there were 39 Fords, 34, 35, 36, right on up 39 Fords. And they had red Volt engines in them, and they could take one of these cars up in the mountains and get 180 gallons of load of sugar on it and come back in Atlanta. And when they set it off, they collected more money than they could if they'd been working. Well, they always was arguing about who had the fastest bootleg car. Well, they got out about 15 miles from Atlanta and actually cut a place in a field, just an old acre field, and they would meet on Sundays, and this is a true story. They would run those cars against each other, and the bootleggers were making a lot of money. The kingpins that owned those cars would bet amongst each other who had the fastest car. Finally, a bunch of people heard about these races, and they started coming out and line up all the way around this fence, and the guys that was driving these cars would pass their hats, and people put quarters, $50 in there, and the bootleggers would split this, but the kingpins were betting like $5,000 on the cars. So that was actually the start of the modified racing that we run at North Wilkesboro and Greensboro and Greenville, South Carolina, Spartanburg in the early years. They were actually bootleg cars with them big souped-up engines in them.
So when did you get your first really good car? What year?
In 1949, Buddy Elliott from Hickory, North Carolina, over here close to Hildebrand, he was at the very first race at Charlotte Motor Speedway, right here in Charlotte, in the first Grand National race, and him and Betty Elliott was sitting out against the fence behind the pits. And everybody else already had a car. I did not have a car for that very first race, and it's hard to believe that Bob says, there's a new Oldsmobile 88 sitting off that fence. Why don't you go over there, Tim, and ask them people, would they let you drive that car next Sunday's race? This was 4 days before the race. I said, Bob, are you crazy? Come on, I'm going to go over there with you. And I walked over and I said, my name's Tim Flock, and this is my brother Bob. And I said, they're going to have this race. And I said, you got an Olds 88 and you can't buy those things. I said, would you let me drive that car in next Sunday's race? And Betty, his wife, was sitting there, and she said, are you crazy? Just like what I told Bob. He said, let me take his car back, and I'll talk to Betty, and I'll be back here tomorrow. And Buddy showed up the next day without Betty, and we started putting some plates in the wheels. That's all you could do with the cars back then. And Buddy let me drive that car, that brand new Oldsmobile 88, in that very first race, and we finished 5th in it. And it was beat up from the front end, and the rocks kept knocking. We taped the front end real good, but it was beat up pretty bad. But he just let me drive it the rest of the year, and that was my first ride in the Grand National.
I can't. I mean, a man lets you drive a brand new car.
Had about 800 miles on it. But he was a race fan, and finally he was a real race car owner, you know.
He's about crazy, too. You know that, don't you?
Well, he had a lot of money. He had a hosier mill over in Hickory, building socks, you know, making socks. But he had a lot of money, and we run Lakewood. We won the Lakewood race in Atlanta with that car, and we run Langhorne, Pennsylvania. But he was enjoying the trips, and it got him away from home. And on the car, well, I kept telling about Betty Elliott a while ago, but on the car we had Nosy Rosie across the top of the windshield, because she was always after us, you know, about that car, and that was her car, and she was going. That was her grocery store car.
Did you ever drive the Hudson Hornet?
Yeah, when Betty and Buddy finally got out of racing, Ted Chester, a car dealer in Atlanta, he had a Hudson Hornet, and he had a bunch of car dealerships. He bought me my first Hudson Hornet in 1952, and we won the NASCAR National Championship, the point standings for 1952 in the Hudson Hornet.
For Ted Chester.
Ted Chester.
Those Hudsons, what did they have that was so exceptional back in the early 50s?
Benny, the Hudson Hornet, the reason that car won so many races, you know, didn't have very much horsepower, but it had a low center of gravity. When Hudson folded years later, Cadillac bought that design, but they called it a low center of gravity, step down design. You had to step down in the Hudson Hornet. The car had so much balance going through a turn. You could go in a turn with a Hudson Hornet on a half-mile track at 80 or 90 mile an hour, and you come off on the backstretch at 80 or 90 mile an hour. You take an Oldsmobile 88 or some other car and go in there at 80 mile an hour, you lose 15 mile an hour. And the Hudson was just like running on a railroad track. It had real good balance, and it would keep the RPMs built up, just like when you're coming off a turn, try to let your car go over towards the wall to keep your RPMs built up. But it was a real good handling race car.
Now, I've heard about this monkey. Now, how did this all come about? You had a monkey that rode with you.
Yeah, we named him Jocko Flacco. Ted Chester, who owned my Hudson Hornet, came up to me one day at the car lot in Atlanta and said, "Tim, I've got a real cute African monkey. Would you let him ride in the race car with you?" I said, "Ted, have you lost your mind?" I said, "I don't believe NASCAR let us do that." But he said, "Would you let him ride?" I said, "Well, you own the car. I'll let him ride." But he said, "Well, first I'm going to get him a little cloth helmet built and a uniform, put Jock on it, put some decals on it," and which he did. A seamstress made 2 little uniforms for him. So we was worried about NASCAR catching this monkey in this car. We run full seats back then, like you got in your passenger car today. So a upholstery shop in Atlanta built a perch where Jocko had 2 nylon belts. He could look out the window of the car. So we parked the car in the infield and waited until they was just fixing to start. "Gentlemen, start your engine." We pulled in line, and NASCAR didn't know this monkey was in the car. And Benny, when they dropped that green flag, and I'm going down in the Hudson Hornet, which I was winning races in, when I'd pass a car, here's this driver looking over, and this monkey grinning at him. They'd almost run into the wall, really. Now, he running 8 races with me, and we was running on a mile track in Raleigh on the 8th race. We had a board on a floorboard in our car with a chain. We could pull that board and had a light. We could see the right front tire, and when a white streak come that tire, you had to come in and change it with about 2 laps.
So you'd worn the tire into the cord.
Wore the tire down to the cord and give you 2 laps to come in. But he had watched me pull that cord. He got out from under both belts and went down, and this is a true story, went down and a pebble hit him on the head, and he come and got on my back. Here I'm running at 85, 90 mile an hour and leading the race. Funny is running second, and Speedy Thompson was third. So I come down pit road, and I real slow and easy, I hand him to a pit crew, and I caught second gear, but Funny come by and Speedy. That monkey cost me $750 difference. But stopping, which has never been done before, in NASCAR history, made a pit stop to put a monkey out of your race car.
Well, NASCAR must have known it after the second or
They
third
didn't
race.
say a word, but you can't do nothing like that no more. You know, when Earnhardt and Waltrip was getting booed 3 or 4 years ago, I told both of them, "Hey, all y'all got to do is get you a monkey, but you can't ride nothing in a race car no more." But I was the most popular guy you ever seen. Everybody in the grandstand had to come down to see Jocko.
See this monkey.
Yeah, I had to fire him after the 8th race. I could never teach him to sign his autograph.
Couldn't you? Tim, what's the most unusual thing that ever happened to you in a race car?
Benny, that had to be Daytona Beach, Florida in 1955. Have you ever been to Daytona and ride down the beach? There's millions of seagulls. And the speed limit uptown, you know, is 15 mile an hour. And some of these seagulls, they just walk in front of your car and they won't get out of the way. You can actually feed them loaf bread or popcorn out of your hand. But I had qualified, like I said earlier, 142 mile an hour, and I was on pole position on that beach road course, which was 4 miles around it. They started the race, Benny, on the backstretch back then. And you go through the south turn, and when I come out on the beach in second gear and popped it back in high, about halfway down that beach, here I'm running around 140, 39, 140 mile an hour, and these seagulls wasn't used to a car coming at them 139 mile an hour, and they wouldn't get out of the way, and they started hitting my windshield, and it sounded like popcorn hitting my windshield, and I looked in the mirror, and it looked like it was snowing behind me in Daytona Beach, Florida. I go all the way through the north turn, and then back down the backstretch, through the south turn, and the second lap, going down that beach. They wasn't a seagull nowhere in that county.
They got the message, didn't
They got the message. It's terrible that I had to do it, but there wasn't anything I could do running that fast, and all them cars behind me. You know. I hated I killed all those seagulls.
What do you do about all the debris? I mean, when you hit the gulls, feathers?
It taught us a lesson. We had a big old wire brush that we had a rope on where it wouldn't go out the window, and we'd reach out going through the south turn and scrape feathers off. In second gear, going up the back stretch, you had plenty of time, and scrape the feathers off, and then catch second and going back. At each lap, you'd scrape something off. We even tried 3 sheets of celluloid, plastic, and have it fixed where you could pull off one after the first lap, second lap, and after the second lap, you didn't have to worry about it. They were gone.
Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I want to talk a little bit about your family.
Okay.
Now, there were 9 kids, is that what you told me?
Nine in my family.
You had 8 brothers and sisters.
Right.
And Bob and Fonnie drove.
Bob and Funny was NASCAR drivers. Funny won 22 Grand National races. Bob didn't run as much, but he did win the modified championship and 4 Grand National before he broke his neck in a Grand National race. My brother Carl raced boats. He won the Chicago World Fair in a boat, those kind you sit on your knees and drive with big motors on the back of them. My sister Ethel, she was named after the gasoline. My daddy named her Ethel. She was a race driver. She ran Daytona with us, Langhorne, Pennsylvania. She ran at Lakewood in Atlanta.
Really?
She ran with Louise Smith. You remember that name?
Yeah.
Sarah Christian. They called it the Powder Puff Derby back then. They had a bunch of lady drivers. The promoters were promoting races and tried to draw extra fans with women in the races, but some of them turned out to be real good drivers. And then my sister Rio was a parachute jumper. My dad started all this. He named her Rio after the first car that came to Alabama. It was a Rio car, but she made 32 parachute jumps when you had to cut the ripcord with a knife. Now, she was really the first daredevil in my family.
You jump out and cut the ripcord with a knife.
It didn't have the ripcord. There wasn't no silk back then. Now, when she was jumping, the silk, they hadn't come in back then for parachutes. But they put newspaper up in the thing to make her bail her out when she jumped out from one of those old biplanes. But she was really the first daredevil in my family.
So you got it honest.
Yeah.
Man.
Flock of flocks.
The flock of flocks.
I'm just proud, Benny, of one thing before we go into something else. They 6 Hall of Fame awards in my family. Isn't that great?
How would you rate, would rate in today's drivers, who would you stack up against those guys back in the 40s and 50s? I mean, who would be able to compete back in the 40s and 50s? Earnhardt, Waltrip?
Well, you named 2 of them right there, be real good. I guess Elliott, there's several of them, but I still believe, and I hope I work with these guys, I see them in the pits all the time, but I believe that we had about 6 or 8 guys back then that run rings around these guys today, because these guys don't know what I'm talking about. We were hungry. These guys are not hungry anymore. They're making $2 and $3 million a year, and they don't have to win. A lot of these races are parades. I've been watching too. A lot of them parades. They sit there back there waiting. You couldn't wait back then. We'd run these 30-lap shootouts or 50-lap shootouts. You had to drive your heart out.
Man, I just love sitting down and talking to these guys about NASCAR's earlier days. By the way, we're bringing you this edition of NASCAR Video Magazine from inside the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. Now, that's inside the Joe Weatherly Museum at Darlington International Raceway. Tim Flock, one great guy. Things have changed, but one thing that has remained the same is race car drivers are still their same feisty selves. Now, the man in charge for NASCAR to keep everyone operating within the rules on the track is Les Richter. He's known as coach, and our Dr. Jerry Punch found out why he's the perfect man for one tough job.
As much as anyone, the man we affectionately call Coach is one of the most important men in all of NASCAR racing. Hello everyone, I'm Jerry Punch, and we're here at NASCAR headquarters in Daytona Beach, Florida. We're going to take you behind the scenes to meet NASCAR's Vice President of Competition, Les Richter.
For 9 NFL seasons, Les Richter was a menacing linebacker for the Los Angeles Rams. Originally drafted by the Dallas Texans, Les held out for a $500 sign-in bonus and was eventually traded for 11 players, an NFL record for over 30 years. These days, Les still keeps people in order, a top cop of sorts as the Vice President for Competition for NASCAR. He oversees all the rules, making sure all competitors stay in line. On race day, you'll find him in the tower, making sure everything goes smoothly.
I'll try to leave the day that the track opens, early in the morning, and I will arrive at the racetrack probably sometime during the first practice, for the most part, the way our schedule is and where we do go, and if we have to go a little bit longer, we'll leave a little bit earlier. There's a lot of things that go on that the world doesn't know about, that are important, that you oversee, you make sure are in place, and what have you. If it's not myself, it's making sure that somebody else is taking care of that, and when you take into consideration all the things that it takes to make a racetrack ready for an event, not just what the racetrack does itself, but what NASCAR requires a racetrack to do also.
Coach, what do you think is the toughest part, the most difficult part of your job in this position?
When we make a mistake, when mistakes are going to be made, but when we make a mistake and we should have never made that mistake, and that's a big disappointment. That hurts. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is we're trying to improve everything we do. When we go to the racetrack, we're trying to have things that they do for us in preparation for us getting there. We're asking them to upgrade those things, and we're trying to upgrade our activities and our people, and failure is disappointment. Failure is losing, and that's, I guess, the old jock in me comes out, that you don't like to lose.
As a middle linebacker in pro football, and every time we talk about football, your eyes, you get that certain sparkle in your eyes. Did you really enjoy the contact?
I miss it. Contact and just, playing against somebody was exciting, and you look forward to the opportunity to play against other people, and that was one of the enjoyments of just playing hard and playing rough and playing tough.
Well, speaking of having to be tough and play hardball, what parallels are there between stock car racing and pro football?
If you were to relate from a competitor side, there are parallels. The physicalness of a race driver is important, as it is being a physically fit football player. And the mental attitude of what you're doing is an extremely important factor. And both of them require keen vision and great reflexes, great ability to respond to situations.
How much longer do you want to undergo the daily stress of doing what you're doing? Is there a timetable?
I haven't got any timetable. Whoever wants to retire. I want to step off the curb and hope I'm looking the other way when a bus hits me.
How would Les Richter like to be remembered if you're not here tomorrow, and hopefully you will be for a long time? Many of us do hope that, but how would Les Richter like to be remembered?
Oh, I guess like I was in football. Played hard, worked hard, played to win, and appreciated everything that happened.
And now for part 2 of the evolution of a race car. To get the whole picture of the evolution of a race car, we brought together at the Sandwich Construction Company in Charlotte 4 legendary men who literally built stock car racing history. There was Ralph Moody of the famed Holman and Moody team, who pioneered the building of the first customized race cars of the 50s and 60s. Banjo Matthews, the car builder of choice for generations of drivers. Dick Hutcherson, a 14-race winner as a driver and innovative partner of the Hutcherson Pagan Shop. And Mike Laughlin, creator of the front steer cars and the most popular car builder on the circuit today. And we're talking with Ralph Moody, Banjo Matthews, Dick Hutcherson, and Mike Laughlin about the evolution of a race car. We call them stock cars today, but Dick, they're really not stock cars, are they?
Not underneath, no. The outside sheet metal is stock, but underneath they're a little bit different.
Well, now Moody, was you around in 1949 when this deal started? There were stock cars then, weren't they?
Yeah, they were stock cars. They had the stock bodies and the rubber things you set the body on the frame with and the whole works, and that's the way you run them, even stock camshafts and all.
The cars were stock enough that you could drive them on the street,
Oh,
correct?
absolutely. I built a 55 Oldsmobile and run it to Darlington, and I drove it from Asheville to Darlington. And I was so tired when I went across Highway 9, a big old stop sign down there. I remember it was about 50 feet high, and I just drove right through it, never even knew it was there.
Mike, when did you start going to the races?
About as long as I can remember. I've seen some of these guys a long time in Augusta, Georgia is where I'm originally from. And we had a half-mile dirt track at a time when Grand National cars would run down there. And I believe Dick has run down there before. I know Ned did, and a lot of them. And I used to go out there and just really be fascinated about all this kind of stuff. And one thing led to another.
But they didn't drive the cars to the
No, not at this time. This was
They'd gotten to be
a little
racing.
further along, right.
In racing, the first segment of the cars were nothing but stock cars. Cars you drove to the street, drove on the street to the racetrack and raced them. Right.
What you call the Grand National cars in '49 were basically the street cars that people had, and they just went to speed contests, like with the 39 and 40 Fords that were what people called the liquor cars. They all got together and raced. When we raced roadsters down in Florida, that's how all that stuff started. I used to go out and watch them run motorcycles in the muck fields with 3 feet deep holes. And, it just, everything went on. The roadsters came from California and Chicago and raced down in Miami. Bill France promoted a race in '47, I believe at Davie Airport, 2 Mile Circle. And they had a stock car race there that Bonnie Flock won, and then they came back with a roadster race, and Tim Flock, not Tim, but Bob Flock won that race for Red Book.
The second segment of the evolution of a race car, they started putting safety roll bars and safety features to the point, taking the headlights out, tail lights, so you couldn't drive the car on the street.
You couldn't drive the car on the street, right?
The third segment was when they started putting the homemade frames in the unibodies, right?
All right. Then the segment of today is you build the bodies out of pieces and totally construct the whole car. And you got Mike sitting over there. He kind of controls the field now of cars, and Hutch and I used to control the thing. So Mike's took over now, and he's the big hero car builder. And I hope he enjoys it, because I enjoyed all my years of it.
What do you think's the biggest evolution in the stock car? From '49 to '92, what do you think's the biggest thing that happened, Ralph?
Oh, I think the biggest thing that happened is when they come up with a fabricated full frame that you could put anything on. And it came about that different businesses started making the pieces you put on the cars, so that everybody, you walk down pit road and whatever someone got, they all have. And if you break something, you can go get it from anybody. It's all pretty basic what every car has got on it.
You agree with that, Banjo?
Well, I agree. The suspension pieces like Holman and Moody made in the early '50s, the hubs, the spindles, all the things that started when the GMC truck spindle came along. All these heavy-duty parts that are made today, the actual 9-inch Ford gear that's used today in the hub design and all was the 1969 design that came from Ford with Holman and Moody, and nobody's made it any better since. Everybody makes them that way. Allowing us to hand make our frames makes it easier repairable. The roll cages are very good. You can go get exterior sheet metal for a car, and all our cars are universal. You can make any kind of a Ford or GM product or even a Chrysler product out of the cars, and utilize their engine, because the transmissions, rear ends, all the front suspension, rear suspension is the same thing. You can go borrow parts off everybody's truck out there somewhere that'll fit on your car to go racing with that day.
Hutch, you agree with that? That the homemade frame was?
I think Banjo and Ralph about covered it. Then, you know, we got a lot better brakes than we had when I was driving, and when Banjo and Ralph was driving. You know, we were running stock type brakes. Now everything's four-wheel disc, and there's a number of things. The clutches, like we were talking a while ago, just one thing leads to another.
Mike, that when they
Pretty
started making the
much.
handmade frames, and so now everything is a racing piece, right?
I would say, and it's, of course, I don't go quite as far back as these gentlemen do, so I can't relate with a lot of the older stuff other than just knowing from being around it all my life, those things that you hear. But I would say that pretty much covers it, other than the aerodynamics now, I think, plays a lot in the safety factor, and a big change in one of the biggest changes is aerodynamics, I think, next to the frame construction.
Folks, what you've seen is over 40 years of stock car construction, driving, and everything else. And as you can tell by the conversation, that over the 40 years, the progression, it's been so slow. The progression has been so slow that, and being a part of it, that nothing really sticks out as the thing that changed racing. Ralph, Banjo, Dick, Mike, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.